Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us in our 2023 Speaker Series podcast. Tonight, we're very honored to have John Powers with us. John was the Assistant General Manager of the Township for many, many years, and we're going to talk about a very important topic, the Performing Arts Center. This topic has come up multiple times, and we looked at it several times at several different situations, and John will discuss all of that. He'll give us a little bit of a history of how the idea or the concept of the Performing Arts Center got started, what we've done up to this point in terms of research and testing. And he'll also talk about sort of where we are today and maybe where we go from here. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn over to Walter, who can give us John's little intro. And John, we're looking forward to your presentation. So thank you for being here.
Thanks, Ted, and thanks everyone for joining this speaker series. It's a real privilege to introduce John. I've known him for many years, and he is the ultimate professional, excellent guy to work with, always even-handed, always comes up with an answer, may not necessarily be right, but it is an answer, which is appreciated. As Ted mentioned, John recently retired from the staff of the Woodlands Township, but that's not his first foray into the Woodlands. He was with the staff that managed first the community associations and then the township for 23 and a half years. And he's done just about everything. He was park superintendent, assistant general manager for community services. And in that capacity, he oversaw parks, recreation, environmental services, neighborhood services, law enforcement, covenant administration, transportation. He got his start in Los Alamos, New Mexico, but looks like was only there for about a year and a half before he hightailed it to the Woodlands. He's got a BBA in environmental management, and he's actually a registered landscape architect. So he's got a backup, career there, a backup opportunity. He's got lots of community involvement. He's a Paul Ayers Fellow in Rotary and was honored by Interfaith as one of the 5 who share. He's been married for 47 years, 2 children, 2 grandsons, and lives in the village of Cochran's Crossing. So again, with great pleasure, I introduce you to John Powers. Take it away, John.
John, while you're transitioning, let me just remind everybody that we will have an opportunity at the end of the presentation to ask questions. So use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to post those questions, and Walter and I will give those to John at the end of the presentation. Thank you, John.
Yes, thank you, Ted, and thank you, Walter. Appreciate that. I appreciate you having me for this speaker series. I'm pleased to be able to share what information I have experienced over the last 20 years. I think that this discussion's been going on. I do have a slide presentation that I'm going to start here with you, hopefully.
There we go.
Yeah. All right. What I intend to do is a short introduction, really a disclaimer. As Ted mentioned, a timeline of the studies and related actions that occurred during those, the highlights of the feasibility studies, the potential sites that were considered, and about the current status. And then we'll have time for Q&A, as you mentioned. A disclaimer here is that this information that I'm sharing is really all available on the Woodlands Township website. They have a great extensive website and one section just on the cultural arts study, as well as information on the consultants' websites, from news articles, and of course my firsthand experience from working for the community associations. This is a screenshot from the township website on the cultural arts study documents. They're going back to when the township, during the township period, not before that, as far as the Town Center Improvement District, which is part of what I'll mention in the very beginning. Because this issue, a performing arts center or cultural facility in the Woodlands, has been going on for decades, Town Center Improvement District actually in 1999 adopted their Vision 2020. And one of their goals was definitely to have a performing arts center or natural science museum and other venues that's in the town center. And I think those people here will recognize all the good things that Town Center Improvement District started or got started back then. They did hire Web Management Services in 2006 to do a feasibility study. And you'll recognize this name coming up again later in the presentation. Back then, they recommended there being a branch of the Houston Museum of the Natural Sciences or a ballet education center or community arts center, small community arts center. TCID decided to go and advance that idea and hired PKF Consulting to look into that more definitely on the feasibility and finances. And they decided to go forward with the museum. But in 2008, the Great Depression waylaid that discussion, and that ended. Did want to mention that in 2011, Mr. Mitchell was on record of saying that he thought the land adjacent to the Cynthia Woods Mitchell Pavilion on the south side of the town center garage, the parking garage, was an ideal spot for a performing arts center. Another milestone in 2015, the township did purchase the old GE Betts building on the corner of Lake Woodlands and Grogan's Mill Drive. It was 11.6 acres, bought it for $15,245. They then hired, they had retained PJL architects and consultants for a transit center study to establish a new park and ride in the town center on the Gold Lot. And I was going to show you some studies that was done then early on about that facility. And then shortly thereafter, Dr. Gottlieb and others came forward to the township, lobbying for a partnership with the Lone Star College to have a regional performing arts center, probably on the Lone Star College campus. That provided the impetus for the township to approve funding in the 2016 budget and released a request for proposals for consultants to do the feasibility analysis. They did select Gensler as the lead member, along with Web Management Services, again, to do a 3-phase feasibility study. First, you can see the cost there. And of course, phase 2 and phase 3 were contingent upon the approval and success of the previous phases. So in March, phase 1 was presented as a draft. It was represented in June with 2 recommendations, that there be an art center and then a branch of the Natural Science Museum again. That continued on to phase 2 in August, where the outcomes of that was presented and phase 3 was approved.
John, can I interrupt you?
Sure.
I think you need to advance your slide.
Are you not seeing August?
No, you're right. Go ahead.
Okay, they kind of go up and down there, Walter.
All right.
So phase 3 was presented in 2018, and then that outcome precipitated a mutual memorandum of understanding with the pavilion, which got approved in January of 2020, had a term of 120 days. But because of COVID and the pandemic, the parties agreed to put the project on hold, and that's been the last activity between the township and the pavilion formally. Some other milestones is in March of 22, the township awarded a bid to tear down the old GE Betts building, to demo it and remediate it. But in February of this year, the township board authorized the township ad hoc economic development committee with 3 major projects to do going forward. One, to evaluate the potential for performing arts center, to evaluate status on the village shopping centers, and then what to do with the property at 9669 Grogan's Mill, the GE Betts building. And then later in the month, they did approve appraisal services for that property. So that's kind of the timeline of real quick, but I'm going to go into these feasibility studies, going back to that first one with TCID, and then briefly on the PGAL. Then we'll get into the 3 phases of the Gensler Web Management studies. Now, early on, back with TCID, they had a multi-phase cultural arts initiative as well, and web management was retained. They're a nationally known firm that does focuses on cultural arts performing facilities and the feasibility and marketing. And they, again, recommended a satellite of the Natural History Museum. Wasn't real clear what all would be involved there. As you can see, Michael Richmond's quote back then, but they did include going forward. They then hired PKF that developed the feasibility for it, but again, it was put on hold. Then PJL was doing work for the township to develop a transit center with grant funds that the township had received from the Federal Transportation Administration through HGAC. And this is just a screenshot of the overlay of the parking garage next to the pavilion that could have been expanded to include a performing arts center. I know they're kind of crazy, but just to give you an idea that they were thinking of a performing arts center on top of the transit center, like on level 6 of a small theater there. This is a rendering that PJL presented, and you can see the performing arts center on top, a park and ride transit center underneath, turnaround for the buses that you can see in the front. And that was to be on the gold lot next to the pavilion. The gold lot is owned by the township, as is the garage, and the garage is leased to the pavilion for operation and management. This was a high-level budget for that concept of being about 25.7 million total back in 2015. Then we fast forward to the Gensler and Web Management team, and they were authorized to do phase 1, a needs assessment, and then, if necessary, phase 2 would be management business plan, and phase 3, the project initiation, architectural programming. In phase 1, Web Management interviewed a cross-section of the community. They did an online survey, had about 1,400 people, I believe, respond to that. They toured and assessed local and regional cultural facilities, studied the market. They also interviewed stakeholders here. Many of the people that you would recognize were involved in one-on-one interviews with Web Management of how they felt the benefits would be for cultural arts facility. This is some screenshots from the presentation Web Management provided to the Township Board of Directors on their outcomes. And 84% of the people were very supportive of it and would attend cultural arts programming if it was brought here. And because they're already doing that outside of the Woodlands. They chose to travel, but they would obviously want to stay at home if it was available. They do support the development of cultural facilities in the Woodlands. And with this information and what Gensler provided, the board did decide to go forward. Here's some survey conclusions, basically, of what I just said is the support from the community that responded to the online survey, as well as those that were interviewed individually. And they came up with the case to continue because the market here, the local market, was growing. It's affluent, well-educated, and people willing to support the arts and culture, both in participation and financially. A lot of community support and user demand. They heard from the art community, both performing arts, visual arts, dance arts, and people needed space for exhibitions, classrooms, performance, and rehearsal. And the facility supplies were opportunities for very high quality arts and cultural places. And of course, economically, has a lot of benefits and impacts to the community. The township, as you know, collects hotel occupancy tax, and there's a strong opportunity there to increase that. And that's really kind of the basis for some of the funding that would go into developing a performing arts center. They made recommendations similar to what had happened in the past of creating a facility that would have nonprofit performance spaces, a museum, an event and exhibit hall, even a digital media center, culinary institute, and Center for Arts and Healings. So broad range of activities and programming that could go into such a facility. The recommendation was to have two separate facilities, an art center and a natural science museum. And it's how they crossed over in the programming that I just mentioned, of how each of those could work in synergy and cohabitate either in the same facility or on the same site. They developed a project components of the Arts Center, which was to be a mid-size and small performance and rehearsal spaces. And there's other components that could obviously go into that. And the users would be schools and universities, local community groups, and touring groups. The museum would primarily be exhibit hall for the public, administration, storage building, a satellite location still for the Museum of Natural History or another part, and have flexible event space for public and private events. The images are from other like facilities that Web Management and Gensler either had experience with or knowledge of. So they moved into phase two. The Township Board approved moving to phase two, which was to include a facility and site assessment, operational analysis, and financial analysis. In part of the analysis, Gensler did massing diagrams to know how much space a facility would require. And for the Arts Center program, it was about 81,500 square feet total on 8.5 acres. This is with 1,000-seat venue and then some smaller venues, 250-seat and 150-seat venues inside the Arts Center, and then the related spaces, related spaces for the other functions. And then a 500-space surface parking lot, again on 8.5 acres. For the museum portion, it was to be on 7 acres and or require 107 acres of a 103,000 square foot facility with exhibition space, education space, a small theater lecture hall of 2,500 square feet, and then the related spaces. So those were massing diagrams of how much space the Arts Center or the museum would require. Out of that, this is a clip out of a community impact newspaper. They always do a good job on graphics. Of the Arts Center would require the 81,000 square feet on 8.5 acres, and then the museum as well. They also had a graphic of the existing cultural arts facilities in the Woodlands. Most of you would all know of the, of course, the Pavilion, have the Glade Cultural Center. There is, at the time, the South Woodlands Arts Gallery. McCullough has the Nancy Bach Center for Performing Arts, and then Lone Star has their stages. And that's important to know in marketing and feasibility of what is in the market already. The 3 sites that were really discussed for the Performing Arts Center of the Township was, and TCID was looking at, were the number 1 being the site south of the parking garage at the Pavilion, next on the waterway, and then the GE Betts building on the corner of Lake Woodlands and Grogan's Mill Drive, which is about 11 acres, and then the Gold Lot. And the Gold Lot became the focus of the facility. And this was a rendering that Gensler provided of what that facility would look like, at least from the outside, again, on the gold lot. It does add to the garage, and that's what began the discussion with the memorandum of understanding between the pavilion and the township. It was executed in January of 2020, and these are the highlights of the MOU. It talks about a 1,500 seat theater with a smaller 200 to 400 seat venue, rehearsal, classrooms, practice spaces, a public gallery space, outdoor space for receptions, to be about 100,000 square feet. And the cost at that time was about $71 million. The pavilion had established its goals for what they wanted, and of course, to increase their performing arts opportunities and offerings to the community and the region, and enhance the facilities that they already have in their cultural education mission. And to be able to provide smaller indoor venue facilities for other performances and musical offerings, making it a year-round operation. The township had its goals, and of course, to support attraction of local regional entertainment that would be an economic driver to the community, to widen the economic vitality here, and to provide facilities that could be used in support of conventions and meetings and trade shows that is across the street at the convention center with the Marriott, and just enhance the access that the community had for performances and rehearsals and support spaces for these nonprofits that are here in the area. They established a vision that's in there to be a world-class operation, that'd be broad and diverse for a number of types of cultural activities and events. Is to be owned by the township and then leased to the pavilion at a rate to be determined. And pavilion would operate at turnkey, as you would expect any kind of large facility like that. And of course, they're well suited because of what they already do. The township estimated that at the time, this is back in 2017, 18, that the maximum capital funding that could be extended through room tax bonding was approximately $35 million. The township would provide the land, but the annual operating support was not to be proposed to come from the township through traditional township sources or through room tax collections, the operating support. The township did agree that they would look at using the township's current events admission tax funding that comes from the pavilion ticket sales, which is 10% of the total event collection, to offset the operating deficits at the proposed facility. And they would consider providing the events admissions tax collected from the venue itself to offset any incurred deficit as well. Also considered extending the term of the existing pavilion events admission tax funding, which has an initial term of 20 years, and shared revenues from the parking ramp, the town center parking garage. The pavilion agreed that they would operate it, and they would provide operating support from use fees, sales, and then allocated taxes and contributions. The parties agreed to form a 501c3 to solicit private capital contributions to fund the project and the construction costs, and they would share the cost of developing it and sustaining it with everyone's time and energy and efforts from the leadership and their staff. The developer calendar, which was a due diligence period of 120 days from January 2020 or 2020, and then after that, they would develop a final agreement for the 501c3 and the drawing and execution of the capital campaign. Of course, that would include process for issuing bonds backed by the room tax, and to do the initial design, bid the project, initiate construction, finalize construction. But in July of 2020, because of the pandemic and the economic conditions, the parties agreed to put the project on hold. That was July of 2020. Not much happened that I'm aware of between the pavilion and the township after that date. But earlier this year, the Ad Hoc Economic Development Committee was reconstituted with projects assigned to include evaluating the potential for this performing arts center, as well as evaluating the village shopping centers and their status, and then what to do with the GE Betts property. And they recently approved appraisal services for the GE Betts property. That's kind of a quick overview of all of that, and we can go to questions and however you'd like to do that.
Thank you, John. That was awesome and good information. And it's important to note that most of what John presented was information that carried up through 2020, right before the pandemic. And as John said, things kind of just went dark for a while because of the pandemic. And I do know the current board is considering taking, based on John's last slide, taking this up again for discussion. I believe they reviewed some renderings, some drawings on one of their previous meetings recently. So I think there's some interest there. One of the big questions that always comes up is cost and how much is it going to cost the residents. So John, I just want to be sure that based on one of your slides, you talked about the cost at that time being $71 million, and that the township could account for about $35 million through taxes it already collects based on the room collection tax and others, not any additional tax to the community. Did I understand that right? Is that?
Yes, you did. The estimated total cost to build the facility was $71 million. The bonding capability the township had at the time, based on the room tax then, would be $35 million that they could retire through that. So that left about $36 million to be raised. And the township had said they wouldn't use any other sources of revenue or income other than that room tax availability. They did agree to discuss using events admission tax monies towards that.
John, I have a couple of questions if I could. You're talking about a 1,500 seat venue. So that's pretty small. So I would assume that the arts facility or the cultural arts facility would be basically for the use of local nonprofit groups and not necessarily designed to bring in, for-profit musical events, plays, etc. Is that correct? Or is the idea to try to raise money through sales of, ticket sales?
Well, sales of ticket sales, revenue from ticket sales, definitely important and critical to the success of the facility. But the question really is about the size of the theater. 1,500 seats, is that large enough to accommodate a Broadway show or not? And the Ad Hoc Economic Development Committee that really led the discussion with Gensler and Webb went back and forth about sizing, along with the pavilion of what they had in mind and what would fit on the gold lot. And that's kind of the limiting factors, is the size of the facility relating to the site itself. And so those massing diagrams that Gensler did becomes important of how much room do you need. So 1,500 seats at that time is what the board had agreed would be the ideal size for the type of facility they had in mind at that time.
What about the museum? Is the board going ahead with the museum as well? Or is the focus now strictly on a performing arts type center?
At the conclusion of the MOU, it was focused on the Performing Arts Center. The space that was programmed there really didn't have room for an exhibition hall. And also the Houston Museum of Natural Science really wasn't as interested as they were earlier. You know, they felt the COVID and the economic impact that had at the time too. So as far as I know, there wasn't any more discussions with the museum or for having a museum component as part of this facility on the Gold Lot. Not to say that there might be room for temporary small exhibits to be displayed in smaller spaces in the facility.
What about that Gensler track? Is there any discussion about trying to put the performing arts and our museum on that track?
You're talking about the Betts track? Walter?
Betts track, I'm sorry.
GE Betts.
Yeah.
Yes, there were several conceptual designs that was discussed of placing the Performing Arts Center and the museum, or one or the other, on the 11 acres that's the old GE Betts building. That was a primary site for some time, and but when the operational logistics and the synergy of a performing arts center began to be discussed with the pavilion, the focus became on the Gold Lot.
We've got some questions from our viewership. So why don't we go to those? Here's one from Stuart S. What is the approximate capacity of the Smart Financial Center in Sugar Land? How would the proposed theater and the Gensler study compare in size to the Smart Financial Center?
To my knowledge, the Smart Financial Center has a theater capacity of about 2,500, I believe. We could check that while we're talking here.
Yeah, I'm
but
looking right now.
yeah,
I've got the website up.
okay.
And yeah, we tried to get somebody from Smart Financial to participate in this program tonight to tell us, about the center, how they financed it, et cetera, but nobody responded to our emails, so we were not successful. But it says on their website, 200,000 square foot venue, incorporates innovative movable walls, from an intimate seating of 3,000 to a maximum of 6,400, 14 luxury suites, corporate hospitality areas, latest sound, etc. 2,500 guest parking spaces. So it's substantially larger than what has been talked about in the Woodlands. And of course, they've got all kinds of events, which of course I have never heard of 99% of these groups, but they appear to be the types of events that probably require pretty good size venue, stage and backstage stuff. So it's really, it looks to be, based on their website, a totally different venue, certainly in size.
Well, I have been to the venue several times, and also the committees, ad hoc members of the ad hoc committee and the board did tour facilities, including the Smart Financial Center and other venues as well. And again, it's about site location and being sensitive to the existing pavilion. We want to enhance, to complement, to support the existing pavilion on a year-round operation, and not to take away from it.
Not to compete with it, in other words.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Here's some more. Ron Sakowski asks, what other cultural arts centers are being proposed in North Houston and Montgomery County?
I'm not aware of any at this time. There may be discussions ongoing and but I'm not aware of any.
It seems like I recall not too long ago, someone was talking about a conversation that they were having in Conroe for some sort of a performing arts center. And I don't know how far along the track that conversation went, and maybe it was stalled for the same reason our conversation was stalled for the pandemic, but it seemed like there were some conversations about that at some point recently.
Everybody ought to go up to Conroe to the Crichton Theater and the Courthouse Square. I went up there about a month or so ago to see Spamalot on a Sunday afternoon matinee, and man, the whole Courthouse Square was packed with people. I was very surprised. It's
That's nice.
of course, they've got the other theater too. They've got two, legitimate theaters up there already. So they've done a very good job of creating a cultural arts hub.
Walter, we got a
John,
couple
I
other
interrupted you.
couple other questions, and then I have a few more questions for John as well, but let's finish up the questions that they gave us.
All right, Matt E asks, will the performing arts facility offer office space if performing arts organizations wanted to lease space at the facility and use the performance hall as their quote residence, close quote?
As far as I know, on the Gensler and Webb management studies, there were discussions about having space available for outside organizations to use. Whether, I don't know if it didn't get into the details, whether it be leased or rented or just available as a reservation. But I don't recall any of it being like a residence where someone would be permanent there, if you will. In the programming space that was in the final design there, and it's really still very high conceptual for the Gold Lot. There wasn't much room available for those kinds of extra spaces.
Here's a comment from Ron. Conroe is doing a 1,400 seat center on North Fraser.
Maybe that's the one that I was thinking of that we heard tales of a while back. John, I got a couple of questions regarding funding, back to where we were talking about earlier. So if the cost was back then 71 million, you're probably looking at a cost of 105 to 115 million today, just with the cost of inflation as we know it, and as the cost of the supply chain issues and all of that. And so the gap that we had once before was the $36 million that someone would have to raise from whether it's private donations or capital campaigns or whatever the case may be. Was that at the time the discussion, was that a logical and a doable number where we could have reached out and started some sort of campaign to raise the $30 million from grants and donations and so forth?
Mm-hmm. Well, I can't speak for the pavilion of how successful they thought it would be. But I believe if you look at the intent of the MOU, that's exactly what they might have been thinking, was to test the market, to see if there was enough to do that, and then to go forward. Of course, it was a non-binding MOU, so there wasn't anything financially tied to it. But from the studies that Webb Management had done going back to 2006, and there was another component of that team, which was Sterling, of how to do fundraising, and they know the market very well. Those reports were very favorable to the township and the pavilion that the capital campaign could be successful.
Oh, good. And I wonder if the current board were to go back and kind of update that survey, if you will, and update all the studies, whether that the new gap between what the cost would be and now what if the township stayed at that $35 million, then the gap for fundraising, of course, would increase substantially based on the cost of increase in cost. I wonder if that then is still a viable number that can be raised through capital campaigns and donations and so forth. because it would be significant. You know, we go from talking about raising 36 million to talking about raising 56 million or 60 million, unless the township wanted to pony up some more money.
Well, you're right on, is the financials should be updated to understand the current condition of the township, the hotel occupancy tax, the event emission tax, and as well as what bonding capability would be with the current interest rates, you know, that's there. It's changed dramatically.
Yeah.
So that's the key to the whole analysis, is to update all of that, as well as to update the potential for charitable giving and sponsorships.
Right. Well, and also the revenue that it can bring in. I mean, one of the whole driving factors of this in the beginning was not only they have the arts and culture here for the residents, but to, you know, be an economic driver for the community. So I would imagine that if everything went up, if the economic numbers also went up, revenue numbers, and the cost went up, we may be still where we were then, you know, having the same ratio. So that could be a possibility. I know a couple other questions came up, Walter, as we were talking.
Yes, anonymous attendee asked, I'm not clear if this is for professional theater and performing arts events or to augment space for McCullough and Lone Star Community College. Will it be for Broadway touring musicals and plays? What is the level of entertainment this will attract?
So my answer would be that it is all of that. It was to be a professional theater that could attract touring musicals and plays of a size suitable to the theater that's related there. So, you know, that's relative. It's like the Smart Financial Center, as you were mentioning, Walter, or the artists that might be listed for their entertainment you might not recognize because they're in a smaller, they draw smaller crowds. The challenge will be for the township and the pavilion, if they decide to talk about this again, is really what size is the right size, to right size it for the financials and for the market. And that's why these feasibility studies were so important from those that's experienced in doing that. So it may not be real clear, but it was to have theater space for performing arts that could augment the existing facilities here, because according to the surveys of those groups that use those facilities, there just wasn't enough space, not enough time. And it was to be a high performing, high quality that would attract entertainment and performing arts from all over to attract people from the region to come to the Woodlands.
Here's a question from Nicole Kerner Bobley. Pardon me if I massacred your name. I believe Conroe was recently granted an arts district designation. Is the Woodlands Township actively pursuing the same designation? If so, do these designations get us access to money somewhere to help us get to 71 million?
So I'm not aware of the township pursuing the actual cultural arts district designation from the state of Texas. That was considered by the Ad Hoc Economic Development Committee years ago, as well as the township board, because of the intense application project that it takes to get an application in. And at the time, the state of Texas had not allocated any funding for the cultural arts district grants. They decided not to pursue the actual designation. They did alternatively designate an area in the town center that would be the arts district. And you may have seen banners that around the boundaries of that art district. But if the township were to pursue that actual designation with the state, that does allow every related organization within the boundaries of the cultural arts district the opportunity to apply to grants to the state of Texas Cultural Arts District Trust Fund. I'm not sure how much will be funded in this biennium, but what I looked at for the last group in Conroe, several organizations in Conroe, and then including one here in the Woodlands, received grants. They're usually for operations and programs and not for capital campaigns. And most of them are going to be in the thousands to tens of thousands of dollars, not hundreds of thousands or millions. But it could be helpful, the art designation and getting grants to the nonprofit performing arts, cultural arts organizations that are within the district, and for the pavilion and or the township to get grant money for programs.
A question about parking. Is there a plan to make up for the parking spaces that would be lost from the goal lot, plus more for growth?
The makeup, yes. That was in the expanded parking garage. As far as growth, I don't know that. Of course, there's never enough parking in the town center already. So I don't know that it would really be accommodated regardless, but the spaces that were going to be lost were going to be made up either on site or adjacent to the gold lot that the township had rights to.
John, if I'm remembering this right, or just making it up, that parking garage was built for 2 additional floors?
Well, yes, but when the analysis came back, it looks like it's only capable for one story, one level.
There's a little capacity available on top of the existing parking lot.
Right.
All right. Any more? We do have a few statements. Any questions? Any more questions?
I got just a couple more, John, that I didn't finish with from
Go
earlier.
ahead, Ted.
So I think you, on one of your slides, there was a possibility of having 2 separate facilities, one being the Performing Arts Center and one being the museum type scenario. Did I understand that correctly? Was that part of one of the proposals or one of the ideas, was to kind of separate the 2
Yes.
formats?
Yes, there were massing studies and conceptual ideas of having 2 distinct separate facilities. And then obviously combining them into one. And those massing studies is what I was referring to, and what the Community Impact magazine picked up on their graphic of having 2 different facilities.
Mm-hmm.
Since the museum component of that has waned away, the focus has been on the Performing Arts Center.
Mm-hmm. So it could be very feasible as a community. We look at the Performing Arts Center now, figure out all the dollars and figure out how it's going to work, and location and everything. And then at some point down the road, if there's an interest in the Natural History Museum or just the museum in general, if we could build a nice facility somewhere else off-site, that would be probably helpful in my opinion. I don't know, but I guess we'd have to see if the interest was there, first of all. My other question, John, had to do with the management of the Performing Arts Center itself. And I know in your graphics, you described that with the memorandum of understanding that the pavilion would operate the Performing Arts Center and, use it, have all the operating expenses and costs and everything else, that it would work through the pavilion. But does this work any other way? I mean, is it illogical to even think that we could put a Performing Arts Center somewhere in the Woodlands that the pavilion wouldn't operate or wouldn't run? I mean, would we even have those capabilities if they weren't involved?
Well, I would think there are the capabilities. However, from the beginning in 2006 with web management, it was always proposed that there be a third-party operator, whether it be contracted or another entity operating the facility that would be capitalized through either public or private public partnership.
Mhm.
But I think to your point, because the community that we have, the people, the leaders, the organizations, that's a possibility. But again, the township, as far as their funding and where they come from, their values, I think, is not to compete with the pavilion. And if the pavilion can benefit from the facility, they certainly need to be involved one way or another.
Yeah. Just makes sense to me. So there was one comment that Walter, were you going to get to the statements, or you were just going to read the questions? Because I did
No,
want
I
to
just
bring up.
thought I'd go through the questions.
Okay, I do want to address this one comment from Pamela, because I think this goes to what the intention of the Performing Arts Center was. She said, I would still go downtown for professional theater if this theater is planned for lesser quality events. I don't think that in the conversation it was going to be planned for lesser quality events, maybe smaller, but of good quality and high quality, I think was the intention when we were talking about this. I don't think it was, I don't think the discussion was, we're going to have a smaller facility, therefore we're going to have less quality. I don't think that was the case. Is that accurate, John?
Yes, that's my understanding. The desire was for high quality events. They may be smaller in scale and size, but still be top notch, world class.
Yeah, and I thought that was the case as we stood. All right. Anything else, Walter?
No, we have no more questions from our attendees, and unless I missed one, let me scroll through here. I do have one question. It's sort of off the wall, but I mentioned to one of our township board members that they ought to look into the Cinemark Theater that's in Market Street that was closed. If we're looking at a 1,500 seat venue, you might be better off leasing that thing under some sort of long-term lease and then reconfiguring the interior to get the event space you need. I don't know if you could do that, put a 1,500 seat venue in there, but it's certainly something ought to be looked into. It would certainly cost a heck of a lot less than $100 million. It wouldn't be as nice and fancy. It wouldn't be right by the pavilion, but you could probably get, well, I don't know if you could, but there's a chance you could get a lot of what we're after at a Performing Arts Center at a much lower cost. So I don't know if they'll pursue that idea, but I have mentioned it to them.
Well, I don't know how accurate this is, but I also heard that they were going to convert that to one of those eating movies, like the Stars and I forget what some of the other ones were, where you can go in there, watch a movie, and actually eat at dinner. That's what I heard recently, that they were.
Yeah, I heard it was leased, but not for movie theater purposes. So it is leased currently. Of course, whether that's a 5-year lease or a 20-year lease, who knows? But we're going to have to get creative. To me, it's going to be difficult.
Yeah, and I think all the
$110 million plus operating expenses.
Yeah, I think all of these facilities can operate, simultaneously and benefit each other and benefit the community as a whole. Well, John, any last comments from you, or any last thoughts on the presentation, or any of the questions before we wrap up?
I just conclude by saying that, there are certain conditions that have changed from 2018 through 2020 that I think does warrant refreshing some aspects of the feasibility studies and the discussion. That's for sure. But I think it's very clear that in the Woodlands, the residents, the visitors, the business community, all support the idea of having a performing arts center here in our hometown. Mm-hmm. And, we are a world-class community. When you look at world-class communities of what the components are, with parks and public art and shopping and education and landscaping and all that goes into it, one of the things that are missing is a large theater like this.
Right.
And I think everyone's ready to try to make this happen. Financially might not be the right time,
Right.
but we don't want to just, forget about it.
Right. Well, I know the current board has an appetite for it, so it's good that they're at least considering and looking at renderings of some of the buildings or how they may look. So I know there's some conversation about that. So that's a good thing. Well, thank you, John, so much for presenting this with this very important topic, and it is going to be very timely as we go forward. Like you said, maybe from a financial standpoint, we may have a few hiccups in the current time, but 4 or 5 years down the road, to enhance our community and to keep it the #1 community, we probably should look at this. So thank you for your information. Walter was right. Both Walter and I have worked with you for over 20 years now, and we appreciate your professionalism, your knowledge, and your dedication to the community. So thanks again for being with us. We appreciate your time.
It's my most pleasure. Thank you very much.
Good, thank you. And as we wrap up, I'd like to remind everyone that the speaker series continues. Our next presentation will be May 2nd, which is the first Tuesday in May. We hope to have Dr. Null with Conroe Independent School District. So he will be talking about the schools themselves, the demographic of the schools, the operation of the schools, the behemoth that the school district is. So we just want to give everyone an idea and a little bit of background on the school district. It's celebrating its 120th year this year. So it's very significant that we all know a little bit more about CISD. So that's our topic in May. And then going forward, we have some other very interesting topics for you as well. We hope to have John back again to talk about Parks and Recreation here in the Woodlands. And John's very well versed in that as he is with a lot of things here in the Woodlands. So thank you all for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it. Continue to follow us at townshipfuture.org. Look for our Facebook page at Facebook/Township Future. We will try to continue to bring you information that's important to the residents of the community, so that you are knowledgeable in what's going on and that you have an opportunity to be versed in the happenings of our community. So that's our charge, and we're going to continue to do that. So with that, Walter, if you'll take us out, we're ready to wrap up. Thank you, Walter.
One last word. If you want a topic discussed, please let us know. We've been sort of second guessing what would be of interest to the community, and quite frankly, we're running out of second guesses. So if you've got a favorite topic you want us to explore, we would be more than happy to do that. Send your suggestions into it's info at
Townshipfuture.org.
townshipfuture.org, and we'll certainly look over those. All right, thank everybody. Thanks, John. Thanks, Ted, and thank all of you attendees. Hopefully we'll see you next month when we learn all about CISD. Good evening.